4th, 9:30 a.m. And then Sunday, May 18th at 9:30 a.m. And for that class, almost certainly there will be homework. And so what we're going to do next week is continue to read verses from chapter 6. All right? Okay. Yes. Uh-oh. Okay.
Everything is working well, but people online were not able to see it yet.
Oh. Well, it's not working as well as that. Oh yeah, Anthony is in Pinion Hill, so he's watching it online. I think,
So, can you ask him if he's able to watch? If he is able to...
Call him. It's not being recorded, is it?
It is being recorded. You're
Right.
being recorded right now.
That's good. That's professional. Anthony, we're in Gita class. Suman asked me to call to find out whether... Are you attempting to watch the class? Is it... Oh, but it's showing up. So we're live talking to you and you can see me. Ah, good. So it sounds good, right? Everything's fine. Great. Okay, see you next time in class. So the next two classes are Sunday, May 4th and Sunday, May 18th at 9:30 a.m. Okay? All right, see you, Anthony. Bye. It's working. He said it just started working 20 seconds ago. All right. So we're starting with 5.27 today, and we're going to attempt to go through 27 through 29, finish chapter 5, and then discuss verses 1 through 3 of chapter 6. That's the plan, if we can manage. So please repeat after me. You can use your phone with the app. There's a Gita app. Most of you I hope have it. Okay, so please repeat after me. Sparshan kritva bahirbahyamsh chakshush chaivantare bhruvoh pranapano samau kritva nasabhyantara charinau. Okay, then verse 28. Yatindriya mano buddhi munir moksha parayanaha vigatecha bhayakrodho yassada mukta eva saha. All right. Translation. Having put outside of himself all outward touches and concentrated the vision between the eyebrows and made equal the prana and the apana moving within the nostrils, having controlled the senses, the mind, and the understanding, the sage devoted to liberation, from whom desire and wrath and fear have passed away, is ever free. These two verses, as Sri Aurobindo points out, and as others have also pointed out, suddenly seem to shift gears in the context of this chapter 5, and start giving teachings on meditation, like traditional sitting meditation, reminiscent of Patanjali's Yoga Sutras. And Sri Aurobindo specifically mentions that, and what's called Raja Yoga. Of the 4 yogas, Raja Yoga is based on Patanjali's Yoga Sutras.
Dhyana Yoga.
Dhyana Yoga. Now, there's a question as to why it comes up at this point and how it relates to the surrounding verses and ideas introduced, right? And so Sri Aurobindo here has a really interesting and I think helpful discussion of that on pages 234 to 5, and I think it's worth reading at least part of it. The very beginning of chapter 23, Nirvana and Works in the World. So let me read that. Sri Aurobindo says, because it also helps us to understand the next verse, 29 as well. The union of the soul with the Purushottama by a yoga of the whole being is the complete teaching of the Gita, and not only the union with the immutable self, capital S, as in the narrower doctrine which follows the exclusive way of knowledge. As always, he's bringing in this concept of the Purushottama, which is only explicitly introduced in chapter 15, but he's reading it back into the earlier chapters and saying that it's kind of adumbrated, hinted at in some of the earlier chapters as well. Okay? And it kind of holds the key to understanding the nuances of these earlier chapters as well. And specifically, he's thinking of chapter 20, verse 29 of chapter 5. He thinks that this idea of the Purushottama is hinted at there. Okay, then he says, that is why the Gita subsequently, after it has effected the reconciliation of knowledge and works, is able to develop the idea of love and devotion, bhakti, united with both works and knowledge as the highest height of the way to the supreme secret. What is he saying? He's looking at the Gita as a whole, which has 18 chapters. And what he says again and again is, chapters 1 through 6, especially 2 through 6 really, are focusing primarily on the path of knowledge and the path of works, karma yoga. Very little mention of bhakti in these first 6 chapters. Little glimpses here and there, but very little. And then suddenly it becomes the keynote, starting with chapter 7. Chapter 9, 12, and and he's saying there's a reason for that. And in these early chapters, there's an emphasis on the realization of the impersonal self. Okay? And he thinks that these verses, 27 and 28, refer to that. Meditation on the impersonal self as a prelude to, or as a kind of precondition for, the higher heights of bhakti practice and realization. Okay. Then he says, for if the union with the immutable self were the sole secret or the highest secret, that would not at all be possible. For then, at a given point, our inner basis for love and devotion, no less than our inner foundation of works, would crumble away and collapse. Union, utter and exclusive with the immutable self alone, means the abolition of the whole point of view of the mutable being, not only in its ordinary and inferior action, but in its very roots, in all that makes its existence possible, not only in the works of its ignorance, but in the works of its knowledge. What's he saying? He's saying that if the highest truth really were the impersonal self, then bhakti doesn't really have a firm basis. It could be a preparatory discipline, as it is in Shankara's philosophy, but you can't continue with it once you reach a certain level of spiritual evolution. And yet he's saying, look at the development of the Gita, the way that the thought structure unfolds and develops. It moves from the path of knowledge, Jnana Yoga, to bhakti, suggesting almost the opposite, that bhakti is actually the summit of spiritual life. That can only be true if the ultimate reality is something that can support bhakti all the way up to the end. And so what is the nature of that ultimate reality that can support bhakti to the end? The Purushottama. Ultimate reality is the impersonal, personal, infinite Purushottama. Okay. So it's not just Brahman, it's Brahma Shakti. It's Brahman and Shakti at the same time, and much more besides. Okay? Okay, does that make sense? Fine? Okay. So now, then he says, it would mean the abolition of all that difference in conscious poise and activity between the human soul and the divine, which makes possible the play of the kshara. Now he's bringing in concepts again from chapter 15. The 3 kinds of purusha, the triple purusha, he says. Kshara, akshara, and third one? Purushottama, exactly. Don't be shy. Kshara, akshara, purushottama. Right? So the kshara is sarva bhutani. Kshara sarvani bhutani. Okay, it's all beings. So this entire cosmic play, basically. For the action of the kshara would become then entirely a play of the ignorance without any root or basis of divine reality in it. Jagat mithya, he says. Right? Shankara's philosophy is Brahma Satyam Jagat mithya. This world is a kind of illusory appearance, it's a dream. So then what's the basis of continued action in the world once you realize that you're in a dream? Not much. Then he says, on the contrary, union by yoga with the Purushottama means the knowledge and enjoyment of our oneness with him in our self-existent being, so I take that to mean the impersonal Atman, and of a certain differentiation in our active being. In our active being, we are the Jivatman, we're participating in this cosmic play of the divine Purushottama, and that how is all that possible? It's supported by Shakti. Because this world is nothing but a dynamic manifestation of Shakti. And even the Jiva is a manifestation of Shakti. Mame vamsho jiva loke jiva bhuta sanatana, which is another verse from chapter 15. each jiva, each individual soul is an amsha, a spark of God. Suman, is that smile a technical difficulty? No. It is, isn't it?
But we can continue.
Okay, it's not a serious thing. Okay, all right. Every week is fun, though. Every time it's. He put in the hard work, though. I saw him. He came at like 5:40, so he. I think there's some problem with our equipment. Maybe. Okay, let's see. Okay, let's keep reading. Okay, then Sri Aurobindo says, "It is the persistence of the latter in a play of divine works, which are urged by the motive power of divine love and constituted by a perfected divine nature. It is the vision of the divine in the world harmonized with the realization of the divine in the self, which makes action and devotion possible to the liberated man, and not only possible, but inevitable in the perfect mode of his being." Okay. So the only way to justify continued action in the world at all levels of spiritual progress, and to justify bhakti all the way to the end, is to posit the ultimate reality as the impersonal personal Purushottama, which has both static and dynamic aspects. Okay, then Sri Aurobindo says, and now he gets to explaining verses 27 and 28 in relation to the surrounding verses. He says, "But the direct way to union lies through the firm realization of the immutable self," capital S, so the non-dual self. "And it is the Gita's insistence on this as a first necessity, after which alone works and devotion can acquire their whole divine meaning, that makes it possible for us to mistake its drift. For if we take the passages in which it insists most rigorously upon this necessity, and neglect to observe the whole sequence of thought in which they stand, we may easily come to the conclusion that it does really teach actionless absorption as the final state of the soul, and action only as a preliminary means towards stillness in the motionless immutable. It is in the close of the 5th and throughout the 6th chapter that this insistence is strongest and most comprehensive. There we get the description of a yoga which would seem at first sight to be incompatible with works, and we get the repeated use of the word nirvana to describe the status to which the yogin arrives." Okay, so now he's getting at how to explain these verses. So what's he saying? Saying we should take seriously the sequence of thought in the Gita. And it's not just random that the Gita starts with an emphasis on the need to realize the non-dual self. He's saying that that provides a spiritual foundation for the attainment of the highest heights of bhakti, okay, and to realize the Purushottama. What does this remind us of in Sri Ramakrishna's teachings? Some of you mentioned this in your study questions. Kind of obvious. Gita, come on, it's a softball.
What was the question again?
Oh, okay, you're not listening.
Yeah,
No. What he just said about, he says first realize the self, and then you can go on to attain bhakti and all that. So what is that? What does that correspond to in Sri Ramakrishna's teachings? Anyone. It doesn't have to be Gita.
Jnana.
Your name is Gita. Yeah, exactly. See, it's so obvious. You're like, duh.
Yeah.
Exactly. Jnana followed by Vijnana. Right? First Jnana and then Vijnana. Jnana, according to Sri Ramakrishna, is the realization of the non-dual self. On that basis, you can go on to attain the greater state of, and the more expansive state of, Vijnana, in which you realize that that divine reality which is nirguna, which you already realized as a jnani, is equally saguna, the personal God, Shakti. And instead of looking upon this world as a dream, as the jnani does, the Vijnani looks upon it as a mansion of mirth, as a blissful manifestation of divine consciousness, of divine mother, of Shakti. Okay? And so Sri Aurobindo says, look at the Gita. And the Gita also unfolds according to a similar structure. It moves from jnana to Vijnana. And in chapter 7 and in chapter 9, we actually find the Gita using the terms jnana and Vijnana. And as I've been taking pains to emphasize, Sri Aurobindo is one of the few commentators I've ever come across who interprets the terms jnana and Vijnana in the Gita along the lines of Sri Ramakrishna's understanding of the terms. Tapasanji does sometimes as well, not coincidentally because he's a monk of the Ramakrishna order. But Sri Aurobindo was a follower of Ramakrishna, doesn't mention Sri Ramakrishna in this book, but does in many other places. But I think his interpretation of Jnana and Vijnana Gita is very strongly influenced by Sri Ramakrishna's teachings on Jnana and Vijnana. Okay? All right. So, with all that in mind, I wanted to first bring your attention to this little detail in verses 27 and 28 about this meditator. He's concentrating his vision between the eyebrows. This is interesting. When you meditate, there are many different places to concentrate on. And in fact, in the gospel, on several occasions, people ask Sri Ramakrishna, where should I meditate? And then in one place it says, should I meditate in the heart, in the head, or where? And then he says, you can meditate anywhere where you feel comfortable, but the heart is one of the best places. But he also says, interestingly, he distinguishes two kinds of yoga. Usually we think about Raja Yoga, Karma Yoga, Bhakti Yoga. In one place, though, in the Gospel at least, he talks about Shiva Yoga versus Vishnu Yoga. Does this ring a bell? It's very interesting. And he says, those practitioners of Shiva Yoga are the ones who lean toward meditation on the impersonal. And they meditate on the impersonal Brahman as a kind of light between the eyebrows. And they start jumping up and down, getting excited about the fact that they're witnessing a dazzling light between their eyebrows. And he says the practitioners of Vishnu Yoga tend to be bhaktas who meditate on and worship God, the personal God, in the heart center. So there's also this, Sri Ramakrishna, at least in certain places in the Gospel, suggests that concentration on the heart is or can be more bhakti-oriented. It need not be. Ramana Maharshi also talks about the heart center in the context of Advaita Vedanta. And that between the eyebrows, he seems to suggest is more potentially more of an impersonal meditation. But just to throw a wrench into that and to complicate things, you know how I love doing that. Sri Ramakrishna also says, using the paradigm of the 6 chakras, when he's explaining them, he says, here at the heart center, you realize what? That you're a jivatman, separate from the body-mind complex. And the sadhaka says, eki, ajyoti darshan hoy. Okay, ar jivatma darshan shikhar ne darshan hoy. So you realize the jivatman in the shape of a flame, and you say, what is this? What is this? This is such a wondrous realization. And you have a vision of light. Okay, then you move up to the throat center. Here you can only talk of God, and you can't stand worldly talk. Now come up here. This is interesting. How does he describe the realization at this center, between the eyebrows?
The light that has the glass.
It's not really light, though. It's really a realization of the personal God, as far as I remember. The personal God. But there's a glass, separating you from God. So there's a slight barrier still. But as far as when I interpret those passages, I see him as saying that when the center of consciousness comes up here, that you're actually having a direct realization of the personal God. Because then the next step is just Sahasrara, the thousand petal lotus, which is the non-dual Brahman realization.
So what was the
Jivatman,
realization
remember?
here?
Jivatman, individual soul, that's not God yet. That's like Ramanuja's Jnana Yoga. That's why I think that lends itself really well to Ramanuja's scheme of yogas. Ramanuja says, practice Karma Yoga, practice Bhakti Yoga in its lower level, like not in the Bhakti Yoga strictly speaking, but all the stuff we do. We go to Arati, we do Japa, and all that stuff, he says, do that from the very beginning. Worship Vishnu and all that. And practice Jnana Yoga. And by Jnana Yoga, he means meditation on your true nature as the Jivatman separate from the body-mind complex. And all those practices should culminate in the realization of the Jivatman, which he calls Atma Avalokanam. Okay? This corresponds exactly what Sri Ramakrishna says. It's the realization of the Jivatman in the heart center. Then you go on to practice Bhakti Yoga, says Ramanuja. Only then are you qualified to practice Bhakti Yoga, because you can't really feel Bhakti for God until you realize yourself as an eternal soul separate from the body-mind complex. Right? And so that's the higher level realization. You realize God between the eyebrows. So I don't think it's a coincidence necessarily that the Gita talks about meditating between the eyebrows. I think even Sri Ramakrishna, and there are many people who suggest that the meditation between the eyebrows is more of an impersonal meditation. Shiva Yoga, as Sri Ramakrishna calls it. And clearly this meditation, these two verses anticipate the entirety of chapter 6, okay, which is actually, it has two titles, either Atma Sanyama Yoga, which means the yoga of self-restraint or self-control, but also Dhyana Yoga. That's an alternative title for chapter 6, Dhyana Yoga, the yoga of meditation. And so these two verses contain in germ the whole meditative practice described in detail in chapter 6, and what we'll find in chapter 6 is almost no mention of bhakti. There's a little bit toward the very end, but not much. And when it talks about the object of meditation, what you should concentrate on, it's not talking about Krishna, it's not talking about God, it's talking about the Atman, typically. Okay. Okay. Anything else I want to emphasize here? Okay, I think we can move on. Yeah.
Don't many of the chapters end with introducing concepts from the next chapter?
Oh, I see. You see that as a kind of general pattern. Can you give another example?
Well, I think 6 does a little bit.
At the very end?
I know I've seen it in several others.
Okay, that's interesting. I mean, we'd have to sit down and look at, but that's an interesting idea to keep in mind. Maybe that's a structural feature of the text.
Not everywhere, but often.
No, it's like Netflix or something. You want to keep the person viewing, excited about the next episode. Yeah. Okay. So now, verse 29. Please repeat after me. Bhoktaram yajna tapasam sarvaloka maheshwaram suridam sarvabhutanam jnatva mam shantim richati. Okay. This one, let me do the anvaya of this one, which is the rearrangement of words. Yajna tapasam means sacrifice and austerities. Bhoktaram, God, Krishna, is the enjoyer of all yajnas and tapas, of all sacrifices and austerities. God is also Sarva Loka Maheshwaram. He is the Lord of all the worlds. Sarva Bhutanam Suridam. He is the friend, Dinabandhu, the friend of all of us, Sarva Bhutanam. Mam Gyatva, having known me as all that. Shantim Richati. That person who realizes me as all that attains the ultimate peace, transcendent peace. Okay? Okay. Now, Sri Aurobindo is very happy with this verse and has a field day with it. And I'll just share with you part of what he says about it. He says, we get back to the great idea of the Gita, the idea of the Purushottama, though that name is not given till close upon the end, meaning in chapter 15. It is always that which Krishna means by his I and me, the divine who is there as the one self in our timeless, immutable being. Here, I take it to be the non-dual self, otherwise what Sri Ramakrishna calls Brahman, who is present too in the world, in all existences, in all activities, the master of the silence and the peace, that's the non-dual impersonal, the master of the power and the action, Shakti, who is here incarnate as the divine charioteer of the stupendous conflict, Avatara, the transcendent, the self, now this is the impersonal non-dual again, the self, capital S, the all, Jagat, the universe, the master of every individual being. He is the enjoyer of all sacrifice and of all tapasya. So now he's directly translating verse 29 of chapter 5. Therefore shall the seeker of liberation do works as a sacrifice and as a tapasya. This is important because what he's doing is extracting from each of these phrases a justification for action in the world and for devotion toward God as well at the same time. And so how is God being the bhoktaram yagatapasam, the enjoyer of all sacrifices and austerities? How does that justify action? Well, because all action is a kind of sacrificing, right? And if it's a service, then it's also a kind of austerity because it requires self-sacrifice and self-restraint to do that. And so the spiritual aspirant should do works as a sacrifice and as a tapasya, right? Okay, he is the Lord of all the worlds, manifested in nature and in these beings. Therefore shall the liberated man still do works for the right government and leading on of the peoples in these worlds. Loka Sangraha. And since God is Sarva Loka Maheshwaram, the Lord of all these worlds, then it behooves us as spiritual aspirants and as children of God to try to help God by serving others and by helping others along, right? In this world, the people who live in this world. That's the logic. And then he is the friend of all existences, Suridam Sarvabhutanam, the friend of all creatures. Therefore is the sage who has found nirvana within him and all around, still and always occupied with the good of all creatures, even as the nirvana of Mahayana Buddhism took for its highest sign the works of a universal compassion. What is the term he's thinking of here?
Nirvana.
No, the person. Very good, exactly, Bodhisattva. The person in Mahayana Buddhism who renounces even his own nirvana for the sake of helping others in this world of samsara. Yeah, exactly. So he's thinking of the Bodhisattva here. Yes, and so the friend of all existences is interesting because God is the friend of all. And see, again and again, starting in chapter 4, you find that God is setting himself as the ultimate example that we should try to emulate. You remember that? He says that, look, I have nothing to do by acting, and yet I act continuously because otherwise all these worlds would collapse. And so he says, you too, therefore, should act, O Arjuna, right? So in the same way, God is the friend of all creatures, therefore we should also try to be friends to all creatures. So what does that mean? Let's not be selfish. Even spiritually speaking, we should not be selfish. Sri Ramakrishna will sometimes, pretty scathingly, I mean, it's kind of interesting in the gospel, when he's contrasting the jnani with the vijnani, in several places he says, and it's amazing because he's talking about these extraordinary spiritual souls, these great Advaitic saints. He's saying, jnanis are selfish. And they're full of fear. Because they only care about their own liberation. And they're full of fear because they see this world as a dream, as an illusion. And so they see it as a kind of threat to the ultimate realization. That's why Totapuri, even after this Nirvikalpa Samadhi, he just kept meditating and he was, making fun of Sri Ramakrishna for worshipping Kali and all that. And then he says, by contrast, the Vijnani has this universal compassion. And he says, the Jnani is like a flimsy piece of driftwood. If even a single crow sits on it, it sinks. But the Vijnani is like a giant log. These days we can say an aircraft carrier, which can carry so many creatures and critters on it and take everybody across the shore of samsara, this ocean of samsara. Okay. And so I think Sri Aurobindo finds in this verse, especially in this phrase, Suradam Sarvabhutanam, friend of all creatures, this Vijnani ideal, this Bodhisattva / Vijnani ideal of the ultimate liberation and salvation being one in which you carry others along with you and not one that is only focused on your own individual liberation. Okay. And then he says, therefore too, even when he has found oneness with the divine in his timeless and immutable self, again, that's the impersonal, non-dual, static self, is he still capable, since he embraces the relations also of the play of nature, of divine love for man, and of love for the divine, of bhakti. So there's still scope for bhakti. Why? Because Shakti is real, and because Brahman and Shakti are inseparable, as Sri Ramakrishna says again and again. And then what about this world? This world is the Leela of Shakti. And Sri Ramakrishna says in one place in the Gospel, Leela Shotto. This Leela itself is true, it's real. So Tapasanji, and then, okay, I'm not going to say, but anyway, there's a Swami who draws a lot on the work of Tapasanji. He says, Tapasanji says, the classical Advaitic dichotomy is Satya Mithya. Brahman alone is Satya, it's true. And this world is Mithya, it's unreal, or it's an illusion. And what Tapasanji says is that Sri Ramakrishna replaces this Satya Mithya paradigm, true, false, real, unreal, with Nitya and Lila. These are terms used repeatedly in the Gospel, right? Nitya and Lila. And this is how I understand Sri Ramakrishna's teachings. On the Nitya side falls both Brahman and Shakti. You see, both are eternal. Okay. This is, I think, some monks even, they sometimes will place Shakti on the Leela side. And I think that'll end up in confusion, because then Leela is a kind of, that's not necessarily as real as the Nitya. They may think. I think that the Nitya side encompasses both Brahman and Shakti. Why do I think that? What's my justification? Well, because Brahman and Shakti are inseparable. They're abhid. They're non-different. And so if Brahman is on the Nitya side, it makes no sense to put Shakti on the other side. It has to be Nitya as well, because it's one with Brahman. Okay. They're the static and dynamic aspects, respectively, of the same infinite divine reality. If that's true, Brahman and Shakti are both on the Nitya side. And Leela is the dynamic play of Shakti. And that is impermanent, but real. God's Leela, the Shakti of Leela, is impermanent but real, but fully real. And even that impermanence needs to be qualified a bit. Because according to Hinduism, this universe is either in a manifest state, in a state of expansion, or in a state of contraction, in the form of a seed, in a seed state, where the names and forms become involuted. And then at some point again, Big Bang, and then expansion and manifestation again, all these names and forms. And then at some point again, Big Crunch, and then contraction again, involution again, seed state. Yeah. And yet, there's never destruction. There's always conservation of energy, right? And so in a certain sense, actually, this world is it's real. I mean, it's not just real, it's eternal. And it's just eternally expanding and contracting, expanding and contracting. So you can say that in this cosmic Leela, this table is impermanent, as table. But this table as physical matter, you can say it's permanent in a certain sense. Why? Because it'll just change its form constantly. In the future, it'll still exist, but in a radically different form. And then eventually it'll be shaped into some new name and form in the manifested state of the universe. So do you understand that? That in a certain sense, and I think this is not emphasized enough. I think most people say this world is impermanent. But in another sense, probably a more elemental and deeper sense, it's actually eternal. It never actually disappears or vanishes. It just changes form. Okay.
Isn't it that when it's in contraction, it's in the seed form, it's still there, but it's in the seed form?
That's what I'm saying. That's exactly what I'm trying to say. Exactly. Or you could, Sri Aurobindo likes the term involution. It's involved. It's an involved state. The names and forms are gone, but the stuff of which the names and forms were made is still very much there, just in a different form. Those clay pots just get melted back into the formless clay. And then again, the formless clay, I'm just using the Chandogya Upanishad metaphor here, will eventually be shaped into different pots. But does it make sense to say that the clay is impermanent? No, the clay is permanent. It's eternal. But sometimes it's formless, and sometimes it's formed into these different pots, the names and forms, right? Okay, so I think that wraps up chapter 5, and this gives a nice prelude to, or segue into chapter 6, because we should keep in mind this concept of the Purushottama, that at the end of the day, it's very important not to get carried away with all these teachings on meditation, on the impersonal Brahman, and making us think that the highest is Nirvikalpa Samadhi and the non-dual self. We should always keep in mind that even the Gita, Krishna is reminding us, hey, don't get carried away, because the whole point of this is to finally get us at bhakti, toward the Purushottama. Okay. All right, so now, chapter 6. Please repeat after me. Shri Bhagavan Uvacha. So, Bhagavan Krishna said, what does he say? 1 second. Let's open chapter 6 here in the app. Anashritaha karma phalam karyam karma karotiyaha sannyasi cha yogi cha niragnir na chakriyaha. Okay. So, karma phalam anashritaha yaha, that person who, anashritaha, who does not hanker after what? Karma phalam, the fruits of his actions, exactly. Karyam karma karoti, but still engages in these in all of his various daily duties. Saha, that person is actually a sannyasi. He uses this fraught term, sannyasi. And he is a yogi, sannyasi cha, yogi cha. And not niragnihi, the person who doesn't light the sacrificial fire, which implies actions and sacrifices which are typical of karmis, people who engage in action. And na cha akriyaha, not the person who renounces actions, fails to engage in actions. So the Gita here is thinking of the traditional concept of sannyasa. The traditional sannyasi, even in the Gita's time, this was the traditional sannyasi, is the one who doesn't engage in any kind of ritualistic sacrifices, so no sacrificial fire.
Monk.
A monk, very much, yes, a monk, but an all-renouncing monk. and one who even renounces actions, physical actions. And so akriyaha. So the traditional sannyasi is also akriyaha, does not engage in actions. Apart from alms, begging for alms, and sitting in meditation and thinking of Brahman, because that's also a mental action. Okay. So this is very interesting. Sri Aurobindo says that these first two verses really set the tone for and kind of frame the entire chapter 6, and they're both extremely important. So this one, Sri Aurobindo takes to mean, the Blessed Lord said, whoever does the work to be done, so the karyam karma, without resort to its fruits, he is the sannyasin and the yogin, not the man who lights not the sacrificial fire and does not the works. So for Sri Aurobindo, both the first and the second verses, which we'll get to in a second, both emphasize that true sannyasa involves internal renunciation and not external renunciation. Okay. He also, in his commentary on his favorite Upanishad, what is Sri Aurobindo's favorite Upanishad?
Isha.
Yeah, very good. Isha Upanishad. In his interpretation of the first mantra, is that second line is Tena Tyaktena Bhunjitaha. And he says, through renunciation, you should enjoy this world. And it sounds super weird to say that, because it sounds kind of like a contradiction. How do you enjoy this world through renunciation? So Shankara has to really do some text torturing, and he ends up with bhunjita instead of, well, it can't mean enjoy the world, because that's crazy. So it has to mean protect, okay, which is not grammatically justified there in terms of its grammatical form, but he says it. And then he has to create a direct object for protection. So he says, so what this mantra is saying is you should protect the Atman through renunciation. So be a Jnana Yogi, be a sannyasin, renounce all actions and protect the Atman by meditating on the Atman. But Sri Aurobindo takes it much more literally and says, no, through renunciation, inner renunciation of desire and ego, you can and should enjoy this world by seeing everything as divine. Isha vasimidam sarvam.
Mansion of mirth.
Mansion of mirth, very much like Sri Ramakrishna's Vijnani, exactly. Right? So he sees these two verses as strongly supporting the idea that true sannyasa is an internal renunciation of egoism and desire. And there's already a verse from the previous chapter which is very much in line with that. Which verse? Anyone? Come on. Anyone with the name of Gita who might know, or someone, or Leela? Both very Vedantic names. Yes.
529, which is that Krishna, I think it's 529. Hold on.
Well, 529 is the one we just talked about.
That
So.
described Krishna saying that I am the enjoyer of the Padma.
Yeah.
And
Okay, but how does that support inner renunciation? Oh, because he encourages us to continue action. Yeah, that's true. Yeah, you're right. And so Sri Aurobindo says that. There's one that directly talks about sannyasa, the true sannyasa being internal. Come on. Anyone? No. 5.2. Way back, 5.2. Verse 2 of chapter 5. Oh, no, not 5.2. 5.3, sorry. Okay. Nyeha sanitya sannyasi yona dveshtina kamshati nidvandvo hi mahabaho sukham bandhat pramuchyate. Know that person to be a nitya sannyasi, the perfect sannyasin and the one who is always a sannyasin, who has nothing to do with external stuff for renunciation of actions. It's that person who has no desire and no aversion in his heart. That's a purely internal definition of sannyasa. Nidvandvo, he is completely free from all dualities. That person, what? Sukham bandhat pramuchyate. He is easily freed from all bondages. And Sri Aurobindo, if you remember, in his commentary on this verse, he emphasizes the fact that, look, clearly the Gita is saying here that karma yoga can take us to the highest. It's not just a preparatory discipline. You don't need to then, at some point, stop karma yoga, practice the path of knowledge, and then you get liberation. No, it takes us all the way. And there are many verses which support that. Karma eva hi samsiddhim, this chapter 3. Through karma eva, through karma alone, Janaka and others attain perfection. Again, another verse which seems to support karma yoga as a direct path to liberation, as Swami Vivekananda himself emphasized a lot. So now, I think that Sri Aurobindo's got a lot of evidence, textual evidence on his side to support his interpretation, that verses 1 and 2 of chapter 6 strongly support this idea that true sannyasa really involves an inner renunciation of egoism and desire. and that it's a kind of deeper understanding of sannyasa than just, the external trappings, just wearing gerua and saying, I won't do certain things that householders do. No, but are you internally renounced? That's the real thing. And if a householder can achieve that internal renunciation, and the external sannyasi doesn't have that inner renunciation, who's the better yogi? Who is more spiritually evolved? That householder. I think this is what the Gita is saying, actually. Right? So it's a pretty radical teaching. But now, how does Shankara interpret it? So these are a lot of the study questions were about this. Oh, so regarding study questions. So I think you guys did a good job in answering study question number 1, in explaining how Sri Aurobindo understands the relationship between 27 and 28 of chapter 5 with 29. We've already kind of covered that. So I'm not going to go in detail here, except that I did ask, can you think of any teachings of Sri Ramakrishna and or Swami Vivekananda that might help illuminate verse 5.29? And many of you gave some very thoughtful suggestions. And so one that was already mentioned is Jnana and Vijnana, but also Sri Ramakrishna's teachings Brahman and Shakti are Abhed. So Vikas talks about that. Vikas from London also talks about Sri Ramakrishna's famous teaching Shiva Jnane Jivesh Seva, serve others in a spirit of worship by trying to see the divine in everyone. Shubho, he also talks about this Jnana and Vijnana. Parimal also, he mentions Shiva Jnana Jivaseva, but he also mentions Swami Vivekananda's beautiful poem Shokar Proti, To a Friend. I have a whole class on To a Friend. It's a Bengali poem of his. And the last stanza, he says, where it starts, from Brahman down to the worm, one who loves all beings truly serves God. So it's the same idea of Shiva Jnana Jiva Seva, but in poetic form. So I think that's also a nice comment. Rosalind Shannal, she points to a number of teachings of Sri Ramakrishna. So she quotes these from the Gospel. Thakur says, Sri Ramakrishna says, the most advanced devotees say that he himself has become all this, the 24 cosmic principles, the Uttam Bhakta, the universe and all living beings. The devotee of God wants to eat sugar, not to become sugar. Another teaching of his that she mentions, he who is called Brahman by the Jnanis is known as Atman by the yogis and as Bhagavan by the bhaktas. Another one, Swamiji says, God is an infinite circle whose circumference is nowhere, but whose center is everywhere. So all suggesting that this world is actually a real manifestation of the divine. I thought that's nice. Patty mentions Sri Ramakrishna's teaching that ultimately you realize, I am not the doer. I am a mere instrument in her hand. O Mother, thou art the operator and I am the machine. I move as thou movest me. I do as thou makest me do. Not I, but thou. But thou, Gita, I'm not going to read the whole comment here, but you say, now with the last verse we can completely include the Saguna world in our embrace, love, and worship of the divine. For those who have read the whole Gita and Ramakrishna's words, this verse clearly states that all worship is of the Purushottama, the Divine Mother Shakti. How else could we possibly worship the Nirguna? How wonderful to know that this is what we are really doing when worshipping Krishna, Ramakrishna, or Kali. Yes. You mean when we worship Krishna, Ramakrishna, or Kali, that we think of them as the Purushottama, right? Is that what you mean? Or as
Well,
Shakti?
they are.
Yeah,
whether
they
we
are.
think of it or not.
Right.
And so we are worshiping the Nirguna as well as the Sakti.
Absolutely. They're equally both. Exactly. Yes. Max adds another nice connection here. He says it reminds him of the motto of the Ramakrishna order, which is coined by Vivekananda. What is it? Come on, Sanskrit. Tell me. Archana, don't be shy. What is it? No. The slogan of this order. Come on. Atmano mokshartham, says the ex-monk here. Okay. Atmano mokshartham jagaditaya. Yes, exactly. For one's own liberation and for the welfare of humanity. Okay. Yes, exactly. The welfare of the world part of that, Jagatitaya. Karthik mentions he's based in Delhi or close to Gurugram now. Daridra Narayana Seva. So this service of the poor by seeing Narayana, God, in the ones that are being served, in the underprivileged and marginalized. Okay, good. So you guys did a great job with that. the remainder of the study questions, 2, 3, 4, and 5, all focus on verses 6.1 to 3 of the Gita. And there's a lot of interpretive complexity here, especially with regard to Shankara's interpretation. And I think where you guys, everybody, or most of you, had difficulty was with Shankara's interpretation of these verses. There are some nuances here that I want to definitely bring to your attention. And we can continue discussing this next week. Since there's no new homework, we can continue it. Okay, now, I think you guys did a good job with study question 2, which is asking about Sri Aurobindo's interpretation of 6.1 to 3. We've so far only discussed 6.1. So let's do this one by one. So, what is Shankara's interpretation of 6.1? Well, I think the best thing to do here is to directly read from his commentary. I tried to put it on the board to some extent here. So first of all, well, no, this is 6.3 actually. But so with 6.1, just let me. Okay, what Shankara does here is he kind of reads this in a metaphorical way. Okay, this verse, and he's saying, yeah, okay. So Krishna is saying that the karma yogi, the person who has renounced attachment to the fruits of his actions, is a sannyasi and a yogi. Okay, fine. And not just the person with the external trappings of sannyasa. But we shouldn't take sannyasi and yogi in this verse in a literal sense or in a direct sense. These terms are meant to be taken in their secondary sense. He uses this language. Okay, so he says this on page 224 of Gambhiranji's translation of his commentary. He says both these terms, monasticism and meditativeness, so sannyasa and yoga, are sought to be asserted in some secondary sense. How is that? He's being a monk, so the karma yogi being a monk. In what sense is the karma yogi a monk? It's by virtue of his having given up hankering for the results of actions. So there's a kind of analogy here between the karma yogi and the sannyasi. What's the analogy? The structural similarity is the karma yogi is renouncing the fruits of his actions. The sannyasi is renouncing the actions themselves. But structurally speaking, there's still a renunciation in both cases. The object of renunciation differs. So, I mean, I think, again, Shankara is kind of, maybe not as intuitive an interpretation as one might expect. Although, I have to mention, there's a guy named Shubho who is a staunch Shankarite. And he also has a colorful way with words. And so he really bent over backwards to try to prove that Shankara's interpretation of these verses are a masterpiece and have absolutely no flaws. And nobody can come anywhere close to Shankara's interpretation. And so I'm going to read you from Shubha's. It is quite funny. Okay, here we go. Shankaracharya, the genius one, as usual, came with the most sensible explanation of these verses. He made it crystal clear. Gita 6.1 calls karma yogis proximate yogis, secondary or indirect sannyasis, because their goal lines up with the real sannyasis and dhyana yogis, the ones who've quit action and renounced the fires. Their work purifies the mind, sharpens focus, a must for yogis, and that focus is the stepping stone to the highest jnana. So yeah, they're the necessary middlemen. And bam! See, it's colorful language. And bam! Gita 6.3 backs up Shankara all the way. No fancy words needed. It straight up says karma yoga is for those who can't sit still in deep meditation, cut off from action. By sticking with karma yoga, they build up mental purity along with focus, climb the ladder, and finally hit that peak, dhyana, where you're locked in, motionless, zero action. And even that is just the warm-up for jnana yoga. This is fun. It's like an action movie, and bam! All right. So thank you, Shubha, for entertaining us. But interesting. So he's kind of defending Shankara's interpretation of these verses here. We can talk about this. What do you think? I mean, he thinks it's plausible for Shankara to take the yogi and sannyasi in 6.1 to mean it in a secondary sense. And so let me finish Shankara's commentary here. So the structural similarity between the karma yogi and the sannyasi is that they both renounce something, even though what they renounce differs. And his being a yogi, a man of meditation. Now here Shankara is taking yogi to mean dhyana yoga. So this meditation. And so he's saying, and his being a man of meditation is from a dhyana yogi. He's this karma yogi is also a dhyana yogi. Is from the fact of his doing actions as accessories to meditation, which means that these actions themselves are helping us to acquire eligibility for practicing this higher level meditative practice. Okay, through purification of mind. Or from his rejection of thoughts for the results of actions which cause disturbances in the mind. So the karma yogi, in order to be a true karma yogi, you have to renounce attachment to the fruits of actions. And so you're rejecting thoughts for the results of actions, right? And it's because of the thoughts of results of actions which it's those things that cause mental disturbances. So if you can remove thoughts about the fruits of your actions, you will have more mental calmness, fewer disturbances in the mind. And what does that mean? It means you're better prepared to practice meditation. Okay. So this is Shankara's interpretation. Let's not get carried away with 6.1 here, and what he doesn't really mean to be putting the karma yogi on a par with the sannyasi and with the dhyana yogi. Okay. But Sri Aurobindo is happy to say that clearly what the Gita is saying is that the karma yogi is on a par with the sannyasi. What's happening here? Okay. And that there's no hierarchy, right? And the word yogi here, different commentators take yogi to refer to different yogas, actually, the practitioner of different. So Shankara seems to take it to mean the dhyana yogi, the meditator. But Sri Aurobindo, I think also more plausibly, takes it to mean karma yogi. Because you find that in chapter 5 in the beginning, when it talks about Sankhya and yoga, Sankhya clearly is the path of knowledge. Yoga there is karma yoga. And so I think the context of the previous chapters, chapter 3, chapter 5, justifies interpreting yoga here, I think, also as karma yoga. And so that person who renounces attachment to the fruits of his actions, he is equally to be considered a genuine sannyasi and a genuine yogi in the sense of karma yogi. That's how I think Sri Aurobindo interprets this. I think it's quite plausible. Sorry, Shubha, but you can keep arguing with me. I'll try to get to your. You have this whole long question trying to challenge me, and it's fun. It's good. We'll try to get to that, but it's long too, so I don't know how much time we have to actually talk about that. But okay. Let's see here. Okay, so we covered Shankara's reading of 1 and Sri Aurobindo's. Now let's move on to 6.2. Please repeat after me. Yam sannyasam iti prahuhu yogam tam vidhi pandava nahi asanyasta sankalpo yogi bhavati kaschana. All right. Hey Pandava, O Arjuna, yam sannyasam iti prahu, that which is called sannyasa, tam yogam vidhi, know that to be yoga. Again, this is very much in line with the previous verse. That which people call sannyasa is actually in truth yoga. He asanyasta sankalpaha na kashana yogi bhavati. Why? Because, so this he is because, for asanyasta sankalpaha, without having renounced sankalpas, which are sort of desires or will in the mind, a certain volition. See, nobody acts, no rational person acts unless they're motivated by desire. There has to be some desire. Sri Ramakrishna talks about this in the Gospel as well. He says, I believe that there's a jar of gold coins hidden underground. And I want that jar of gold coins because I'm poor and it'll make me rich. And then I start digging to get to that jar of gold coins. So that desire for the gold coins is what motivates me, along with the belief, right? So belief plus desire is what motivates action. So now, this is how Sri Aurobindo interprets it. He's saying that you cannot be a yogi without renouncing the desire will in the mind. Okay. And so how Sri Aurobindo interprets this is this, that the karma yogi has to renounce the desires for the fruits of actions. Right? That's what karma yoga is. Right? And the sannyasi equally has to do that. And so in a certain sense, the true sannyasa is renunciation of this inner renunciation of attachment to the fruits of our actions. So it's very much like 6.1 also. This is how Sri Aurobindo is reading it. Okay, which means that I think what Sri Aurobindo is saying is that both verses 6.1 and 6.2 are suggesting that true sannyasa is perfectly compatible with acting in the world. You don't actually have to renounce physical actions. The deeper and truer sannyasa is the inner renunciation of desire and egoism and attachment to the fruits of our actions. And that is perfectly compatible with continuing to act. Okay? In direct contradiction to that, Shankara says, in his reading of the second verse, 6.2, he has a very clever interpretation here. Okay. So here he takes yoga to mean karma yoga. Okay, that's the first thing to keep in mind here. Okay. And he asks, accepting what kind of similarity between karma yoga, which is characterized by engagement in actions, and its opposite, renunciation in the real sense. See how he's saying real sense? So renunciation in the real sense is always sannyasa in his own sense, which is you have to physically renounce all actions. Which is characterized by cessation from work. Has their equation been stated? So he's saying, yeah, okay, fine. So on its face, this verse is really equating sannyasa with karma yoga, but we can't really take that at face value. So how does he take it? When such an apprehension arises, the answer is this. From the point of view of the agent, there does exist a similarity of karma yoga with real renunciation. For he who is a monk in the real sense, from the very fact of his having given up all the means needed for accomplishing actions, gives up the thought of all actions and their results, the source of desire that leads to engagement in work. This karma yogi also, even while performing actions, gives up the thought for results. Thus, because of the similarity of real monasticism with karma yoga from the point of view of giving up by the agent, karma yoga is extolled as monasticism in this verse. Okay. Okay, so what's he saying here? This is what I think he's saying. See, there has to be a renunciation of the thought of the desire. So, sankalpa here, the term is sankalpa in Sanskrit, okay? And it kind of has different shades of meaning, so different commentators will understand it in different ways. But it's a kind of thought that arises in the mind which can be accompanied with certain desire. So as I said, belief plus desire leads to action. Like I believe there's a jar of gold coins buried in the ground. I desire that jar of gold coins, and then I act to dig under the ground and then finally get to that jar of gold coins. Okay, so now, monasticism in the real sense, sannyasa in the real, what Shankara is calling the real sense, is ultimately you have to get at the renunciation of all physical actions, right? But what he's saying is, so for he who is a monk in the real sense, from the very fact of his having given up all the means needed for accomplishing actions, gives up the thought of all actions and their results, the source of desire that leads to engagement in work. So there's a kind of chain reaction here. There's a sankalpa that leads to the desire to act and then to the action itself. Okay, and so the only way to renounce physical actions, so the true sannyasin is the one who renounces physical actions, but the only way to do that is to renounce the sankalpas. You have to renounce
the
those.
Thought.
Yeah, the thought.
So the thought that leads to the desire.
To act.
And the desire that leads to the action.
Yeah, exactly. So this, like, he's going back in the chain and saying that even the sannyasi, the true sannyasi, has to renounce those sankalpas in order ultimately not to act in the world. And he says the karma yogi renounces a very similar kind of sankalpa, which is a sankalpa in the form of attachment to the fruits of his actions. I want what? To get rich by getting that jar of gold coins, right? He has to renounce that. But he still acts, but without that attachment to the fruits. That's the difference between the karma yogi and the real sannyasi. So he's distinguishing the real sannyasi from the fake one or the metaphorical sannyasi, right? So the karma yogi. So again, I think he's really bending the verse here, and doing his best to interpret. And Shubha, I guess, also thinks that this is outstanding.
Swami,
Yeah.
if we accept all the different paths, can't we just see that as just another viewpoint?
We could.
And, say that they all have their own truth to it, if that's as far as you want to go?
Yeah, no, I mean, I read that. You said that in your study question response too. And that's fine. I mean, I think that there's a danger in that approach of veering to this extreme of kind of postmodern relativism and saying that anything goes and, why can't we all just get along? And all interpretations are equally valid. And so the Gita is actually not about God, Krishna, talking to Arjuna on a battlefield and about talking about karma yoga. And it's about Martians being vegans. Like, yeah, why not? I mean, that's fine, right? So no, I mean, there have to be some standards of, I think, and it still makes sense, and I still think it's valuable to argue that some interpretations are more plausible and more textually grounded and justified than others, and so that's why I think it's useful to still talk about some interpretations being more plausible than others. But yeah.
And I just think that if you look at the big picture of Bhagavad Gita itself,
Mm-hmm.
Shri Krishna is taking Arjun, attaining Nirvana through Karma Yoga.
Mm-hmm.
He's not saying that renounce all action.
No, because Arjuna is a warrior.
Exactly. So at the end of the goal
Yeah.
is for him to convert his action into yoga.
Yeah.
That's what he's trying
No,
to
that's right.
take. So
But Shankara here will say
Right.
Arjuna is an inferior spiritual aspirant. And so because he's a dum-dum, Shankara is giving him the dum-dum teachings. Right?
I think Shankara is trying to twist it a lot of it has
Yeah.
in one verse itself here.
Yeah, no, yeah, I mean, hey, I agree with you. But let's take it up with Shubha here. And, okay.
I would have to accept what you were saying, because if you accept what Shankara says, then a whole bunch of the other parts of the Gita are
Yeah.
thrown out.
Yeah, so, yeah, I mean, I think that's right. And I think it's really important. And I think one of the greatest virtues of Sri Aurobindo's commentary is that he has this synoptic understanding and knowledge of the Gita as a whole, all 700 verses. It's as if they're all present in his mind at once. And he's always doing this, what I call this beautiful mind kind of thing with John Nash. Have you seen the movie? So it's like his mind works differently. So he's just literally seeing like a wall of numbers and then seeing connections with other people. So I think he's doing the same thing with the Gita. Is that it's remarkable if you read the commentary. Like in the context of chapter 6, he'll bring in 18 and 15 and 2 and just like show how everything is this very dense and beautifully interwoven tapestry, right? And how every verse is connected to every other verse. He does that with the Isha Upanishads too. Actually, I have an essay on that. I think it's a very powerful thing. Whereas what I find in the traditional commentators, not just Shankara but Ramanuja and others, is that they tend to be more linear, and their commentaries tend to be more discrete. Like it's like when they're commenting 6.2, they're talking about 6.2. They do refer to some other verses sometimes, but it's not nearly as comprehensive and as synoptic as the kind of interpretation that Sri Aurobindo is doing. Okay, I do want to at least start on 6.3, and then we can continue the discussion. And a bunch of you had questions, and I'll maybe address questions next week. But let's actually start on 6.3, please. It's a very interesting verse, controversial. Please repeat after me. Arurukshor Munir Yogam Karma Karanam Uchyate Yogarudhasya Tasyaiva Shamaha Karanamuchyate. Alright, Yogam Arurukshoho, that person, that sage, Munehe, who is climbing to or ascending the hill of yoga, climbing up the hill of yoga. Okay. For that person, karma is considered to be the cause. Karma is the karanam. Karma means action. Okay. Yoga arudasya tasya, but for the person who has already ascended to the top of this hill of yoga, shama eva karanam uchyate. Shama is considered to be the cause. So the verse is a little cryptic in some ways because this word cause is used twice, and yet we don't know what it's the cause of. Exactly, we get the cause but not the effect. And so we're told that two things are the causes at different phases. One is for the one who is a spiritual aspirant, karma is the cause. And then for one who has already attained in some deep spiritual sense, shama is the cause. What is shama? Well, different commentators have different interpretations. So, okay, so now let's look at this. How does Sri Aurobindo interpret 6.3? In a nutshell, I think most of you did a nice job here of explaining Sri Aurobindo's interpretation. Karma yoga, he takes karma here to mean karma yoga. This is the cause of Brahma Nirvana, or self-perfection. Okay? And you realize the non-dual self, or Brahman, and you attain purity of mind. And then you attain what he says is the calm of self-mastery. And this is his rendering of the term shama. Okay? The calm of self-mastery. Now notice the language here. There's no hint that this calm of self-mastery entails inaction or the renunciation of actions. Right? It's an internal mastery of self. The word Swami, by the way, means... Swami can mean husband too, right? Lord. But the monk is the one who is Lord of himself, who has conquered himself. That might be a reason why monks are traditionally referred to as Maharaj. Maharaj means great king, right? Raja is king. Maharaj, why? The greatest of all kings. He's not the one who has conquered a kingdom or rules over a kingdom, but who has conquered the self, conquered the lower self. And actually in a couple more verses in chapter 6, the famous verses come, Uddaret Atmanatmanam. You should raise the self by the self. And how do you do that? By conquering the lower self. So the sannyasi is the one who has conquered the lower self, the lower impulses, egoism, right, and so on. Okay, so now, according to Sri Aurobindo, shama is the cause. So once you've attained this calm of self-mastery, this Brahma Nirvana, this self-perfection, then that becomes a cause of what? Of fixity in self in the midst of action. So this is crucial to Sri Aurobindo's interpretation. There is continued action from the very beginning of spiritual practice, in the middle, and all the way at the end. Even when you've attained the highest realization of the Purushottama, you continue to act. Not for the purpose of purification of mind, not even for the purpose of God realization, because you've already realized God. But you continue to act. Why? For lokasangra. That's the term used in other verses in the Gita. As a bodhisattva, as a vijnani, you act for the welfare of humanity, to help others, to serve others, right? That's the idea. Okay, so that's Sri Aurobindo's interpretation. I think you guys, as I said, did a good job there. Shankara's interpretation, he has a field day with this, and as Shubho says, and bam, 6.3 backs up Shankara all the way. No fancy words needed. Okay, so Shankara, karma yoga generates mental purification, chitta shuddhi. Okay, so for those who are spiritual aspirants, karma yoga is the cause of purification of mind. And then the second line of the verse, Shankara will interpret as, for those who have ascended to the hill of yoga, that means people who already have purified minds. Shama is the cause. And here he takes shama to mean inaction, quiescence. Okay. But here he says shama is the cause of what? Of eligibility to practice dhyana yoga. And one thing that I think a lot of you missed, and I'm not blaming you for it, it's actually very tricky, and I think there's some scholarly controversy about exactly what Shankara's views on this issue is. The question here is this. Shankara is now talking about 3 yogas, okay? Not 2, but 3 yogas. What are the 3 yogas? Karma yoga, dhyana yoga, and jnana yoga. And one of the mysterious things is, within Shankara's framework, how exactly is Dhyana Yoga related to Jnana Yoga? How is the yoga of meditation related to the path of knowledge? Okay? And what Shankara says, the Sanskrit term here is, he says, Karma Yoga is a Bahiranga sadhana, which means it's a kind of, it's distant from, it's like saying someone is Antaranga versus Bahiranga. Like Sri Ramakrishna would say some people are on the outer circle, some are on the inner circle. He would say the same thing about these sadhanas. Shankara says, Karma Yoga is a Bahiranga sadhana. It's a kind of, it's just a preparatory discipline. He calls Dhyana Yoga an Antaranga sadhana. So it's like, it's deeper and it comes closer to the ultimate goal. But it's not equivalent to Jnana Yoga. And I don't even think it's right to say for Shankara that it's part of Jnana Yoga. Okay, it might be for some post-Shankara classical Advaitins, but I don't think it for Shankara. Why? Because again and again in his commentaries, he distinguishes two kinds of Brahman. He says Upasya Brahman and Jnana Brahman. Upasya and Brahman and Jnana. These are the Sanskrit terms. Upasya and Jnana. See, upasana means worship or meditation. Upasya means the object of meditation. So, upasya Brahman is Brahman understood as an object of meditation. That is something on which you meditate. And what's the result of that? Perfect concentration of mind. Right? Jnana Brahman. Jnana, it comes from jnana. So, jnana means that object to be known. The object of knowledge. So, Brahman is the object of knowledge. Is what is the focus of Jnana Yoga, the path of knowledge. Whereas the Upasya Brahman is the focus of Dhyana Yoga, that which is to be meditated upon. Okay. So I think Shankara takes chapter 6 to be describing a kind of non-dual meditation of sorts, something that's described in more detail in for instance, a classical Advaitic text like Panchadashi. Vidyaranya talks a lot about this Nirguna kind of meditation. But that's not the same as the path of knowledge, according to Shankara. And it's not even part of the path of knowledge, but it's very close. And it also, and I think that the deep similarity between the path of meditation and the path of knowledge is that they both require more or less physical renunciation of actions. You have to sit still for meditation. That's why if you look at Yoga Sutras of Patanjali, that's also, it's meant for monks who have renounced actions. I visited Kapil Mutt in Jharkhand twice, actually. I stayed for a week the first time and a couple days just before I came to Hollywood to pay my respects again to the Swami. And the tradition there is, this is founded by the great Hariharananda Aranya, one of the greats of all time, the scholar yogi in Sankhya Yoga. And their tradition is, there's a single sannyasi monk who lives in a man-made cave. And there's a window which he opens only a couple times a year for a couple days when devotees can come visit on those specific days. And then he'll talk through that window, but he'll never leave that room. And it's a tapasya that for his entire life, he will never leave that room under any circumstances. Except the one concession is, for exercise, he can walk on the roof of the cave. Okay, so there's a roof to this cave. So anyway, but it's an artificial cave. Huh?
Food.
It's I think he cooks. So they deliver the ingredients, the devotees, through the window, I guess. He'll get the food through the window and then he'll cook himself. And he'll meditate all day, basically. And so it's very much, I mean, that tradition of yoga is very much strongly grounded in the traditional sannyasa ideal of renunciation of all physical actions. And so I think Shankara says that's one of the reasons why Dhyana Yoga is an antaranga sadhana, which comes very close. So it's almost like it's like a Karma Yoga is a preparatory discipline for purifying the mind, which makes you eligible to practice the higher discipline of Dhyana Yoga, the yoga of meditation, and you concentrate on Nirguna Brahman, and that will help to cultivate eligibility for Jnana Yoga, which is this Shravana, Manana, Nididhyasana, which finally is the focus where you can realize Jnana Brahman, the Brahman which is to be known. Okay.
So essentially he's saying that the Jnana Yoga is really an already acquired result as opposed to being a process itself.
Yeah, that's part of the reason why I think that's a good point. I think that's part of the reason why he puts the yoga meditation on a lower footing than Jnana Yoga, because with meditation it's like I need to attain something. There's something I don't yet have in which I need to attain, which is Chitta Vritti Nirodha. That's the term used in that's Sri Aurobindo mentions that too in Patanjali. yoga is chitta vritti nirodha, the restraint of all mental modifications.
Calm the
My mind is full of all sorts of disturbances and thoughts, and I need to get rid of them. But Jnana Brahman is, you're already Brahman. All you have to do is know that you're Brahman by removing the ignorance about the fact that you're Brahman, right? And so there's a fundamentally different structure, actually, in these two yogas. And yet, as I said, he's placing dhyana yoga, the yoga meditation, on a higher footing than karma yoga. Okay, so it's a little complicated, and I think this is one of the nuances that a lot of you missed. And as I said, for good reason. I'm not blaming you for it. It's really kind of tricky here. I think Shubho with his BAM, he gets it though, because he says that. Yeah, but anyway, I think you said that. Yeah. Okay. Did I cover, what did I say about Shankara? Oh, yeah, so I covered Shankaras. Now, Tapasanji. This is one where I think we'll end on this. Tapasanji. His was a little tricky, in my opinion. And one of you, at least, there are a couple, but one of you very explicitly, I like Patty for her boldness. Hi, Patty, San Diego. She says, Swami Tapasanji's commentary is a bit confusing. He explicitly states that the need to continue doing works is critical for those in the early stages of the spiritual discipline, otherwise they will get lazy and lost in the world. This does not mean performing random tasks, but following one swadharma. So that's fine. But while performing their swadharma, they can learn to practice inner renunciation, which can get them to the next stage of spiritual growth, which is the shama stage, which he translates as quiescence, which I take to mean inaction. However, Tapasanji on page 188 clarifies that quiescent does not mean withdrawal from all actions. At this stage, they can continue to perform works in the spirit of yoga and with a complete surrender to God. If that's the case, why use the word quiescence, which I define as dormant or inaction? I had exactly the same question when I was reading Tapasanji's commentary. So let's look at the bottom of the board here. As far as I can tell, this is Tapasanji's interpretation of 6.3. He says, karma here means karma yoga. Fine. What is that the cause of? Our higher spiritual evolution. We get a pure mind. We become spiritually evolved. And then he says, for the person who has ascended to yoga, the highly evolved spiritual aspirant, shama is the cause. He takes shama here to be introspective quiescence, or just quiescence. And quiescence as an English word really just means inaction. You don't do stuff, right? You sit still. And that is the cause. Well, the cause of what? Tapasanji says the cause of perfection or liberation with or without action. And this is where it gets complicated, because then he says, well, yeah, shama is quiescence, but it doesn't mean that you have to stop acting. You can continue to act. But then Patty's point, and my question is, then don't use the word quiescence. If action is optional, and you can either choose to continue to act or to renounce action, don't call it quiescence. Call it something more like the calm of self-mastery, like Aurobindo chooses. And don't confuse it so much. And then you... Or maybe the more generous interpretation of Tapasanji would be to say, or that he understands shama in two different ways. And so you can take shama to mean introspective quiescence for the people who choose to renounce actions. Or you can take it as a kind of calm of self-mastery, a la Sri Aurobindo, where action can continue. And I think that he would have been a little bit more... less confusing and more consistent if he instead of translating shama just as quiescence, he could have said, look, it can be understood in these two different ways, one of which is compatible with action and another which is not. That's the way I see it. But yes, yeah. Okay, first Gita and then Archana.
Didn't he say something about after that you get to the top, then you don't, once you get the realization, then you don't need to act anymore.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
In other words, but you can still act.
Yeah.
But you don't need to.
Absolutely, you're right, and you said that.
So isn't that...
But how do you explain quiescence? Why does he call it quiescence? Why does he call shama quiescence?
Quiescence is where you don't need to. You
Well,
can sit in there.
okay.
But you can also...
But that
choose
seems to me like you're stretching the meaning of quiescence. Okay, I can just literally do a dictionary search on. But
it's the meaning of means that's the problem, I think. Because you can get to quiescence, but it's not the...
Okay, you ready?
You've
Oxford Dictionary.
desire.
Inactivity or dormancy.
Yeah. But it's the means. If it's the means, then...
That's what I'm saying. I think the opposite is saying quiescence doesn't necessarily mean quiescence. or it's like
Would you
I don't know.
Would you have been happy with quietude?
That's I mean
Shanti.
maybe that's a
Say
little
Shanti.
bit more fudgy in terms of
Shanti, Shamaha, like peace, quiet.
see how he's going. Aurobindo is going with calm
Yeah.
because the beauty of calm is you can still act while being calm internally, right? And so he's interpreting the shama in more of an internal state of calmness kind of way, peace, inner calmness.
Maybe his English wasn't
Yeah.
The classic Indian English justification. It's possible. I love going there, but Suman loves it when I do that too. Okay, so all right. I think we can stop here. And sorry, I didn't actually address any of your questions, but I promise I will try to tackle some of them at least in the next class, which is next Sunday, May 5th. Am I right? 4th, May 4th. At 9:30 a.m., our usual time. Okay. Any final thoughts? Or are
Was
we
that
good? Yeah.
Shama different from the
Shama.
Shama?
Yeah.
That's a whole different word than the other Sama that we were talking about.
What is
We were
Sama?
just-
Shama Dhamma Shat Sampati.
Oh, Shama.
Yeah. Sama,
Oh.
Sama, I think it is. That's
No, it's the same word actually.
It is the
Yeah,
same.
exactly the same word. It's the same word spelled the same way.
like prana, pana, sama.
No. That's sa. That's a
Yeah.
different sa.
But
Okay,
that's a
now
whole
we're
different word.
well. Okay, so now we're really getting confused here. So there's sama, which means kind of equality or equanimity. That's the sa. But notice how this word is sha, shamaha. But there are actually two kinds of shama, and they're related. One is in the shat sampat, the 6 treasures in spiritual life. Shama and dhamma. Dhamma is control of the senses, the sense organs, preventing them from going outward. And shama is control of mind, inner control of mind. Now, obviously, this is really how Sri Aurobindo is taking shama. And so there's some good justification, actually, for his interpretation of shama as a calm of self-mastery. It's a kind of inner self-control, a control of the mind. Yeah, thank you. That's a good question. Okay, any last thoughts? Guest? No? We're good. All right.
It's happy to be here.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you so much for attending. See you next Sunday, or if not before. Om Shanti 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 Hari Om Tat Sat Shri Ramakrishna Arpanamastu. Thanks. You're a trooper. She came to my Trabuco talk in the morning. So did you.
Wow.
So did Archana and what's your name again?
Avni.
Avni. And
Amit.
Amit. And what's the connection?
He's my brother, my bhabhi.
Okay. I don't know what bhabhi means.
Brother's wife.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Sister-in-law.
Sister.
There we go.